there's no suggestion at any point he was in a position to be able to defend himself?
No.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
The mapping of the phones and the specific vehicle gave us quite a reasonable picture. Both the movements, both the phones and the car over the preceding days.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
We have to live with that, day in, day out. You can't shut it out. It just takes over everything.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of Michael Keane in August 2016 was one of Blackburn's most violent cases. I'm meeting the senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the methods they used to bring the killer to justice.
My name is Paul Withers. I was a detective superintendent in the Lancashire Constabulary. I also performed the role of a senior investigating officer, and I worked for the best part of 30 years as a police officer in Lancashire. I think it was a callous attack, a cowardly attack. It was unnecessary. It was a waste of a decent life.
Paul,
Morning.
thanks very much for coming in.
Yes, no problem. Very nice to meet you.
Paul, the case we're going to talk about today relates back to August 2016. What were you doing then? What was your role?
My role at that time, Steve, I was a detective superintendent and performing the role of senior investigating officer in East Lancashire.
So my understanding is some reports came in about an incident in a town called Darwin. What were you being told at that time?
Emergency which service?
Steve, I received a phone call from a colleague of mine who advised me that there had been a stabbing on Hazel Avenue in Darwin. It was during the late afternoon of Thursday, the 25th of August. When I realised that stabbing is a fatality, involves a fatality, I would assume a senior investigating officer responsibility for that entire inquiry. The victim was still lying in the front garden of the address in Darwin. I made my way to the scene and spoke with police officers who were present.
What were you being told by the officers that were already there?
I was advised that clearly the scene had been secured at the earliest opportunity, so there was a cordon on the house. There was a tent currently being erected over the deceased to kind of try and maximise any forensic yield we could get from a deceased clothing from the front garden.
You were trying to ascertain who were people living in the house?
Yeah.
What were you told?
We were advised that the address was occupied by a gentleman called Michael Keane. Michael was 42 years of age. He'd been a resident of Darwin all his life. He lived at the address with his girlfriend Anne-Marie West and Anne-Marie's daughter.
As I parked the car up, I saw loads of police, a cordon up, ambulances. My name is Jacqueline Keane. I am the mother of Michael Keane. As I ran over, I saw Michael on the floor, covered with a white sheet. It was raining, and I'm thinking, it's getting wet through there. I knew, obviously, it was dead, but I didn't know how at that time. There was a woman across the road filming it. Just filming it on her phone. And the police officer that was there at the time, I said, will you go and ask her to stop filming, please? So she went over, she took the phone off her and deleted it.
You need to go inside the house, but you're not going to just walk in and wander around and have a look around, don't you?
Everything I do from that point, Steve, is about maximising my evidential yield, and you know, that includes the forensic strategy at the house, the search strategy at the house, the forensic strategy in the garden, the search strategy in the garden.
When you went into the house, what were you presented? What did you see?
There was significant blood staining throughout the premises, and it appeared to have been the scene of a very violent attack, and you know, we needed to unpick that.
When we use forensic scientists, etc., inside a crime scene, essentially what they're trying to do, they're trying to build a picture of what's happened, using clues from, for example, the distribution of blood.
Yeah.
Where the blood is, the pattern of it.
Very much so, yeah. And, you know, we take, you know, a real close examination of that blood patterning. You could see clearly that the main blood staining was in the living area, but then there was drip marks down the hallway and into the kitchen. And you know, I'm pretty certain that they had come from Michael as he'd fled and endeavoured to flee the scene.
So you've got Michael in the garden,
yeah,
and the violent attack within,
that's correct,
the main part of the house.
Yeah.
Most murders, there's a link between how a person died and their life, either their lifestyle or something within their life or someone within their life. So you need to build up a good picture of your victim, don't you?
We very quickly found out that the people that lived there was a gentleman called Michael Keane. Michael was 42 years of age, and his girlfriend, Anne-Marie West, who was a similar age. We also have witnesses that, you know, Anne-Marie West said you'd sustained the injuries. She has fled the address and shouting that he's stabbing us to death, he's stabbing us. Anne-Marie had sustained injuries to both her back and her arm, and Anne-Marie had been taken through to hospital for treatment to her injuries. So clearly it was very important to dispatch officers to the hospital to try and get that very early account from Anne-Marie, what had happened and what had led to the fatal injuries to Michael Keane. So, from the early accounts from Anne-Marie West, an individual arrived at their address on Monday, the 22nd of August, and he'd been living at the address with them. The reason for his attendance at the scene was because Michael owed the Liverpool organised crime group money. So this was a drugs debt, potentially for up to £1,000, and that the individual had been brought there to kind of enforce this debt, to get Michael to work on behalf of the organised crime group, both dealing drugs, but also to introduce friends and associates. And let's not lose sight of the fact that these people use extreme violence and threats and intimidation to make sure that the vulnerable people don't try to escape or don't report it to the police. So they're almost kind of trapped, almost held hostage within their own home addresses with you know, limited options really in their eyes, I'm sure.
It's just a frightening situation. They're on their own up against organised criminals that they know that will mete out violence just
Absolutely.
like that.
Absolutely. It's, yeah, and the treatment of Michael and Anne-Marie for the duration of that week was quite frankly horrific.
So your priority now is to identify who this man is and try and get hold of him?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we do get information from Anne-Marie offering up certain names. Stu, I think were two of them. She clearly didn't know who he was. She could give a very, very clear description of him, give a very clear account of what he'd been doing for the duration of that week when he'd been living with them, but she didn't know who he was. And clearly that was an initial challenge.
Investigation today is around the CCTV. CCTV cameras are everywhere on houses, business premises, and even on doorbells nowadays. What evidence were you getting from your CCTV inquiries?
So we did identify a very good CCTV opportunity directly opposite the scene. When we looked at the footage on this CCTV, it showed a male that matched the description provided by Anne-Marie West. potentially the person she referred to as either Steve or Stu. The description that Anne-Marie had provided, 6'2", slim build, that matched the description of the individual running past the camera. So this was a good evidential opportunity.
So you've now got an image of the person you believe to be the killer running away from the crime scene.
That's correct, Steve, yeah.
When it comes to murder investigations, regardless of a victim's background, their lifestyle, the choices they made, detectives will give everything, they will give their all. In every single investigation, they won't do more in one and less in another.
So you would have deployed family liaison officers. In relation to Michael, who was the family? Who was the contact?
So the family liaison officer worked primarily with Jackie, with Michael's mum, and clearly endeavoured to provide as much support and guidance as they could to the family members.
Fresh face, laughing, joking, telling jokes. When he started school, he got nothing but praise off the teachers. His written work was amazing for a little boy. They said at that time he was a high flyer. Things started to change when Michael moved to secondary school. Michael started to get bullied. He wore glasses, he had red hair, and he had freckles. He tried hard to overcome the bullies. But then, in his third year, it got too much, and he got in with a crowd of lads and started skipping school. They were getting in so much trouble. But at that time, I didn't know that somebody had introduced him to cannabis.
Michael initially got involved in using cannabis. This very quickly escalated to the use of amphetamine and then stronger stuff such as heroin.
He got diagnosed with schizophrenia, which now I know is something related to the Class A drugs he was taking.
And, sadly in this case, Jackie wasn't able, and the family, Michael's sisters, weren't able to kind of bring him back from this kind of world of heroin addiction.
When I investigated murders, I didn't differentiate between my victims. I didn't give one more effort than another. One victim has been murdered and died. No matter their choices in life, they didn't deserve that to happen to them. So every murder was given the same amount of effort.
Sometimes when you're dealing with particular murder investigations where a victim has put themselves sometimes in a position, whether voluntary or they had no say in the matter, but they're in a position, particularly around criminality and drugs, it can sometimes feel that there's a lack of sympathy for them, particularly if you're dealing with the media. Is this something that you came across with Michael?
Very much so, and it resonated with me for quite a while. I'd dealt with a number of homicides in 2016, some of which received significant media attention on a national basis. It felt that they weren't overly interested in the death of Michael because of his lifestyle. They didn't seem to be bothered, and it didn't rest well with me. I felt very uncomfortable with it, Steve. Almost like he was a kind of second-class citizen. We desperately wanted to do our best for Michael. His family clearly loved him dearly. They were a very lovely family to deal with, were incredibly supportive of the investigation.
When a phone becomes relevant to an inquiry, particularly on a murder inquiry, the police will make an application to the phone service provider
Yeah.
asking them for details of who the phone might be registered to. Sometimes phones are registered, sometimes they're not, particularly when criminality is being used. People might not register their phone.
Yeah.
What were these inquiries telling you?
We have a number, 893, that we believe is owned by the offender. Well, the inquiries with 893 actually did identify a subscriber to that number, and this was a female, and clearly she became a key line of inquiry, and ultimately helped us to identify that 893 was being held and being used by a young man called Daniel Bamford, who was 18 years of age at the time.
So this is a huge turning point for your investigation here, because you've got a phone number, 893, that you suspect is being used by
Yeah.
the person that killed Michael.
Correct.
Originally you only knew him as Steve or Stu.
Yeah.
Now you have a name.
We have a name, and you know, with further work around that 893 number, it would show its location for the duration of the week and before, and it very much tended to corroborate the account provided by Anne-Marie that this individual had been resident in Darwin since Monday the 22nd. We also had information from Anne-Marie that a silver Renault Scenic had dropped Daniel Bamford off at the address on the 22nd of August, the Monday.
It's going to be really important for your investigation to understand the build-up to the killing and understand the circumstances around Michael, Anne-Marie and this man in the house. What did you learn about the build-up?
Yes, Steve, you're quite correct. During the initial part of the investigation, through interviewing witnesses, we also became aware on Monday the 22nd of August, Michael was attacked by someone who called at his front door and threw what we believe to be ammonia in his face. Michael ran to a neighbouring property for help. Clearly he was in a lot of pain with the ammonia being thrown in his face. A short time later, a number between 6 and 7 Merseyside residents turned up at the neighbouring property and were asked for Michael. As a result of this, Michael was asked to leave by these neighbours. They were frightened of the people outside, and Michael returned to his home. A short time after this was when Daniel Bamford was delivered to the address on the 22nd to almost act as an enforcer to recover the drugs debt that Michael owed. Bamford arrived at the address with numerous different weapons, and you know, that was kind of the start of an incredibly difficult week for both Michael and Anne-Marie.
Drug dealers across the country have very similar patterns in how they work.
Yeah.
What will quite often be the case is it's actually a phone number that is the way in which the drugs are sold. And it might not necessarily be the same person holding that number all the time, but drug users know, if I want to get my crack, my heroin, whatever it is, I'll call this number and speak to the person on the other end.
That's correct. We knew from the information we were being given that the name Bry was being bandied about as the drug dealer, and a mobile number that ended in 267 was the mobile number relating to Bry, or Brian. Now, my belief is that there was no Brian, and that Brian or Bry was the name given to the drug dealing phone. So clearly that is a key line of inquiry right from the outset.
And the gangs that were at Darwin were coming from Liverpool.
That's correct. Merseyside organised crime groups were, you know, exploring new markets, I suppose would be a term I could use, mainly through the exploitation of vulnerable people.
But that's really key, isn't it? Pick out and prey upon people that they can manipulate in order for them to sell their drugs for them.
Yeah, 100%, Steve. They will arrive in an area, they will identify people who are involved in a drug-taking lifestyle, and then they have an in. They have an in then to the specific area. They will utilise the vulnerability of the people who reside in those areas to deal for them, to introduce them to new drugs markets. And, you know, as you say, it's very, very profitable. I think some of the figures bandied about for this case were that they were earning about £5,000 a day just using the via Michael and Anne-Marie. That's an awful lot of money in anybody's book, really.
In London, we have an expression for this kind of behaviour. We call it cuckooing. Is that a similar expression?
Yeah, and I think that's a term that's used nationally, Steve, and clearly they're moving into somebody's home, and they're treating the home of these vulnerable people as their own, using it to deal drugs, on occasions, kicking the people out that live within the address to go and ply the drugs on their behalf.
And quite often the people they're preying on are almost outside of the law in terms of they're not the sort of people that are going to go to the police and say, I'm being used, I'm being bullied, because of their dependency on drugs.
Anne-Marie and other witnesses began to give us a detailed account of what's taken place that week within the address.
So you've now got information that the drugs line that was within Michael and Anne-Marie's house still being used, and you're now starting to link it into a motor vehicle and another phone.
Yeah. We were pretty happy that we were dealing with the two correct telephones, mobile telephones. We were reasonably happy around the Renault Scenic with a registration number ending CAV. And we clearly began to build our case around that vehicle, those two telephone numbers, and also with some of the information and evidence that was provided by Anne-Marie West. It transpires that the 893 number shortly after also phoned a local taxi firm, and we spoke to the taxi driver, indicated he'd collected a white male from Goose House Lane in Darwin, and that this male had been conveyed to Charnock Richard Services on the M6. So again, these are really, really significant evidential opportunities that are being presented to us.
Dotted around the country are cameras that record registration numbers as cars drive past.
Correct.
And that will give you an exact time and location of where a car was.
It does.
Occasionally you might have a photograph associated with it. That will allow you to map out movements of a car. What you'll then do simultaneously to this is apply to the phone companies, and they will provide you with information of where and when those phones have connected to phone masts. And you can overlay those on a map.
The phones were resident within the kind of St Helens area on a regular basis, but also in Darwin. And as you say, the mapping of the phones and the specific vehicle gave us quite a reasonable picture of kind of the movements of both the phones and the car over the preceding days.
A crucial part of a murder investigation is the post-mortem, sometimes referred to as an autopsy, and it has several purposes. The first purpose, and the most important one, is to identify a cause of death. What actually caused this victim's death? But as well as that, they'll be trying to establish the circumstances around the death. So, for instance, did the victim put up a fight? Were any restraints used? Was there any violence that was used that wasn't connected with the death? For instance, bruising, cuts, etc.
What did this post-mortem examination tell you?
That Michael had been stabbed approximately 15 times. Indeed, the pathologists believe that one of the wounds had penetrated Michael's back and come out the front of his chest. Such was the size of the weapon and the ferocity used in the attack. Both his lungs had been punctured. A lot of his major organs had been perforated by the weapon.
What you've just described to me there is quite a horrific injury.
Yeah.
So a knife was put into his back with such ferocity that it came out of the front of his body. Did he have any defensive injuries to his hands?
No defensive injuries to his hands.
So there's no suggestion at any point he was in a position to be able to defend himself?
No.
All the injuries were to his back?
Yeah.
For me, that's conjuring up quite a horrific scene.
Yeah.
Somebody looking away from the person stabbing them,
Dealing in drugs is extremely lucrative. So the gangs associated with this will use extreme levels of violence to ensure their share of this wealth.
In order to control the drugs lines and keep that money coming in, these gangs use extreme levels of violence, don't they?
Oh, yeah, extreme violence, you know, and this was a prime example. Michael was stabbed 15 times using quite a large kitchen knife.
You can't become a competent drug dealer unless you've got the propensity to commit serious violence. My name's Ian Broughton. I'm a drug trafficking expert witness. So I will look at the evidence from a drug trafficking case and explain the sometimes complex issues that might feature within the evidence. Now, there are different types of violence that we commonly see within the drugs trade. So the first one is the violence that is committed by persons that consume drugs, and that's that violence in order to commit offences to raise money to go and purchase drugs, in order to stave off that pain of addiction. And 50% of all acquisitive crime in the UK is committed in order to fund drug use. So that's all your shoplifting, all the theft of and from vehicles, all the burglaries and robberies. The second type of violence that you commonly see is the psychopharmacological violence. Now, that is violence that's committed by people who are under the influence of drugs. And then the third type of violence, this is what's potentially happened in this case. It's the violence that occurs as drug dealers try and take over other drug dealers and territories. That's why a lot of drug dealers will carry weapons. So I'm not surprised at all at the levels of violence and the fact that this murder occurred. Unfortunately, it's an all too common occurrence, and it's not extraordinary for things like this to happen.
We clearly thought we had a very strong suspect at this time. You know, the evidence was being corroborated by numerous different inquiries, and clearly Daniel Bamford became somebody we needed to speak to as a matter of urgency. As I say, the level of ferocity involved in the attack, clearly a very dangerous man, individual who wouldn't hesitate to use extreme violence on someone. So, you know, it was imperative that we got to grips with him at the earliest opportunity.
When a person is arrested for murder, initially, police are allowed to keep them for up to 24 hours. But with the authorisation of a police superintendent, that can be extended by 12 hours, making a total of 36 hours. After this, police would need to go to a magistrate's court and apply for warrants of further detention. This would take it up to a maximum of 96 hours or 4 days.
Whenever the police identify a suspect for a crime and they know that they need to arrest them, what will happen is that they will get circulated onto what's known as the police national computer.
Yeah.
So should any officers happen to stop and speak to them and do a check on them, they will know that these people are being arrested. So that's something you would have done as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah. This is something that was done very quickly once Daniel Bamford had been identified, and we also put markers on the Renault Scenic, the silver Renault Scenic, that clearly it was being used in crime and needed to be stopped.
What sort of picture were you building up of Daniel Bamford?
There were extensive inquiries around Daniel Bamford. You know, much of the intelligence was held by Merseyside colleagues, and we started to develop a kind of bigger picture around him. We also became aware of another vehicle, a Vauxhall Agila, that was also registered to an address in the St Helens area. Registered to a gentleman by the name of Paul Swift. It became very, very clear from the inquiries we conducted that this vehicle had driven across to Darwin shortly after the murder of Michael, and that this vehicle had been dispatched to collect Daniel Bamford after he had committed the murder.
Essentially what you're describing there is somebody who's assisting an offender after an offence has taken place.
That's correct. From the inquiries we made through ANPR, through CCTV, through telephony, it was clear the vehicle had been driven by Paul Swift in the company of a young boy who was 17 at the time called Reese. And they had been dispatched to collect Daniel Bamford from Darwin. It transpired they had difficulty locating Daniel Bamford, so Bamford had been instructed to ring a taxi, make his way to Charlotte Richards Services. We know that the Vauxhall Agila drove to the service station, picked up Bamford and took him back to a flat in the St Helens area. I was delighted that on the 26th, on the Friday, we received a call from Merseyside to say that the Renault Scenic had been stopped on Lower House Lane in Liverpool and that 3 occupants had been arrested, including Daniel Bamford, Reese and then another male. Daniel Bamford was arrested on suspicion of murder and the others were also arrested suspicion of assisting offender and being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs.
As the person leading on this murder investigation, that's a fantastic phone call to have, isn't it? Because it takes away so much of, just for instance, the risk that has to be managed around an arrest, going into an address, potentially armed, and the complications that can cause.
Yeah.
That's now been taken away.
Yeah, it's a big relief to have him in custody. On the 27th of August 2016, in relation to the Vauxhall Agila, the registered keeper of that vehicle was Paul Swift. He was also arrested on suspicion of being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs and also assisting offenders. So we clearly worked out quite a comprehensive interview strategy in relation to Daniel Bamford. You know, on many occasions when you're investigating an offence of this nature, you just get a series of no-comment interviews.
So you've now got 3 people in custody, one of whom you believe is the actual killer.
Yeah.
Sometimes people misunderstand the purpose of an interview. They might think that it's about trying to get a confession out of somebody.
Yeah.
But it's not that, is it?
No, it's about eliciting as much information as you possibly can. Again, you are trying to build a picture of what's taken place. You're trying to unpick the lies. You're seeking corroboration.
The person being interviewed doesn't have to answer. They've got a right to silence.
Yeah.
There may be repercussions if they don't speak later on at court, but at this early stage, they have the right to not say anything. What did Daniel Bamford say in his interview?
It was quite a surprise, actually. You on occasions tend to think you're going to get no comment. That wasn't the case with Daniel Bamford. But he offered a number of pre-prepared statements. And in those pre-prepared statements, he indicated that he had been living at the address on Hazel Avenue for a number of days. He was there to enforce a drugs debt that had been run up by Michael. He estimated that was approximately £700, and I think he suggested an ounce of crack cocaine. And that's why he was there. He admits to stabbing Michael. He claims he was asleep at the address when he was attacked by Michael and Anne-Marie, that Michael was wielding an iron bar, Anne-Marie West was holding a large knife. He suggested that they were trying to steal his money and his drugs, and he claimed that he was acting in self-defence. He took the knife off Anne-Marie West, that Michael was standing in his way and stopping him from fleeing the address. He denied stabbing Anne-Marie and suggested that she had stabbed herself during the melee. And then he went no comment to all other questions.
Essentially what he's saying is that, yes, I stabbed and killed Michael,
Yeah.
but I did so in self-defence. You've got information that's come from Anne-Marie, which kind of mirrors it. There's some corroboration between the two.
Yeah.
So you have essentially a pretty good idea of the build-up to the killing and what's happened afterwards.
Yeah. And on the Thursday morning, Bamford was very clear to Michael and Anne-Marie that they needed to repay this debt by 4 p.m. and advised them that his friends were coming across from Merseyside, and I'm pretty certain that Michael genuinely feared that both him and Anne-Marie would be killed. You know, this is the point where Michael and Anne-Marie are thinking, we need to do something about this. We can't simply wait and suffer an inevitable fate. Remarkably, Daniel Bamford fell asleep at the address, and I think both Michael and Anne-Marie saw this as an opportunity for them to escape and go to the police for support. We know that whilst Daniel Bamford was asleep, Michael used a dumbbell and struck Daniel Bamford to the head, and Anne-Marie subsequently advised us that she held a large kitchen knife out towards Daniel Bamford in a semi-threatening manner, trying to support Michael in getting him out of the address so they could seek support and protection from the local police.
Your team would have put together a file for the Crown
Yeah,
Prosecution
that's correct.
Service, which would have included all the evidence you had at that time for them to make an assessment on, do they believe there's a prospect, essentially, of a conviction for murder?
That's correct.
And what was their decision?
They authorised a charge of murder, and they requested for Bamford to be held in relation to the drug-related activity to allow further work to be done with that.
So essentially they're saying the evidence you've presented to us is sufficient for a charge for murder.
I did.
In relation to the other offences around the drug dealing,
Yeah.
essentially you need to go and do a bit more work
Yeah.
to bring that up to a level we'll be satisfied to charge him with.
Yeah, correct.
If a person is convicted of a serious assault or a serious sexual offence, the prosecutors may apply that they be deemed a dangerous offender. This would affect the sentencing being handed down by a judge. In principle, it's to protect the public from these type of offenders.
In February 2017, the trial commenced at Preston Crown Court. At the beginning of the trial, both Reece and Paul Swift pleaded guilty to assisting an offender in relation to their activity and actions on the 25th of August 2016. So we clearly just had the matters relating to Daniel Bamford to deal with. He was facing, at that point, charges of murder, a wounding, grievous bodily harm with intent on Anne-Marie West.
All the time in the dock, Bamford was mean-moaning to his family, making faces, pulling faces. It was horrible. Never, I don't wish that on anybody, to have to sit behind them listening to what they were saying. I was looking straight at him, saying what he'd done.
A real kind of standout moment for me was the evidence of Anne-Marie West. Anne-Marie was clearly very vulnerable to her addiction. She was also terrified of the people who had been involved in this incident. Despite this, she gave her evidence, very honest and open about her lifestyle, but also about what had happened on the day and the days preceding the 25th of August. And she did incredibly well.
So during the course of many murder trials, alternative indictments are introduced.
Yeah.
Did that happen in this case?
It did, yes. The jury were given the option of finding Daniel Bamford guilty of murder. Alternatively, they could find him guilty of manslaughter. They also clearly had the option to acquit him. So they were the options that the jury had on this occasion.
It comes to a jury verdict.
Yeah.
How are you feeling at that stage?
You feel incredibly nervous. You feel very, very apprehensive. Your thoughts are with Michael and particularly Michael's family. You know, this is an absolute huge moment for them. This is a huge moment about getting justice for the loss of the life of their son and brother, uncle, much loved. You know, it's very important that the verdict is the right verdict. So initially the murder charge, and sadly they came back with a not guilty for murder. They then came back with the manslaughter charge, which they gave the verdict of guilty. So they found Daniel Bamford not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter.
How did that feel?
Incredibly disappointing. The judge imposed a 12-year custodial sentence. Clearly that's quite a lengthy custodial sentence for an offence of manslaughter. But he also imposed an extended 4-year licence on Daniel Bamford because of the psychiatric reports. He classed Daniel Bamford as a potentially dangerous offender that was likely to pose a significant risk of causing serious harm to members of the public.
How they come to the conclusion that it was manslaughter, I will never know. It was absolutely horrendous. And to walk away feeling like Michael meant nothing, absolutely nothing to that jury. He wasn't a person, he was druggy.
They then move on to the wounding with intent on Anne-Marie West, and again, horrified to hear the jury come back with the verdict of not guilty. Clearly they thought Anne-Marie had stabbed herself in the back and cut her arm in the melee. Anne-Marie was clearly devastated by the fact that she was not believed by the jury. We certainly believed her. The suggestion she'd stabbed herself in the back was ludicrous. Unfortunately, the jury believed him. She found not only the loss of Michael very difficult, but she'd been brave enough to go to court, give her evidence. You know, and I think the verdict, you know, the not guilty for the offences against her was very difficult to comprehend, and I know it had a profound impact on Anne-Marie. Bamford thought it was, you know, amusing.
It's an extremely tragic case with a pointless loss of life of somebody. When you look at what drove it, it was the drugs trade. It was that greed that drug dealers are engaged in order to try and get money.
Michael was such a happy child. But things happen. Shouldn't happen, but they do. But we have to live with that, day in, day out. You can't shut it out. It just takes over everything.
A very difficult verdict to hear. I felt it was very unjust. I continue to reflect on that, you know, for many, many years. And again, I do wonder, was the social background and Michael's lifestyle, being a heroin addict and cocaine user, was that indicative of the reason why they found Bamford not guilty of his murder, albeit they found him guilty of manslaughter?
What I was struck by when I was talking to Paul was his absolute determination in this case to not only get the person that killed Michael, but also those that helped that individual out afterwards. I got a real sense that he cared, and that's what I saw in this case. The work that Paul put in and his team to really get that justice for Michael and his family. And I can also see the disappointment in Paul that the evidence that he saw presented to the court, he thought justified a conviction for murder.